Well, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on another one of our speaker series at the Center for Latin American Studies. My name is Manuel Lacayo. I'm the Associate Director for the Center. It is my pleasure to welcome our Vice Chancellor for Global Affairs, Dr. Ariel Armani, as he introduces Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, who is a graduate of FIT, very proudly, and on one of the 2 terms. And without taking any more of your time, I will just hand it over to Ariel. And just know that this event will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after it's edited, probably at the end of the week. Without further ado, Dr. Armani.
Gracias, Manuel. Thank you. Welcome. As I introduce our speaker and the talk today, I want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about the person, I want to talk about the topic, and I want to talk about us as a university. So the person, today's speaker, Eduardo Gamarra, as Manuel said, Peter Lam. He got his PhD in political science in 1987, and very proudly, a certificate in Latin American studies from the center. He's a professor at Florida International University, FIU, a professor of political science, and he directed their very, very well-known, very famous Latin American and Caribbean Center from 1994 to 2007. In 2016, he was appointed founding director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at the Green School of International and Public Affairs of FIU. Eduardo has written tremendously, more than a dozen books, more than 100 scholarly articles. And in addition to that, he has served as the principal consultant on security sector reform, foreign policy, campaign strategy, and strategic communications to several heads of state and governments in the Americas and different branches of the US government, including the US Agency for International Development, the Department of State, and the Department of Energy. He has testified many times before US Congress on topics such as US policy toward Latin America and the state of affairs in the Andean region. Because that was not enough, he has also been a consultant to multilateral agencies such as the World Bank, UNDP, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Organization of American States, and the European Union. And he's a frequent commentator. Probably you read him or saw him in many outlets, leading media outlets, including ABC News, CBS News, CNN, BBC, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and many others. And he is the founder of a consulting firm, Integrated Communications and Research, which has an active portfolio of public and private sector clients throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. His most recent consulting work has centered primarily on market research and public opinion polling, and we will be hearing about that. And much of his polling has been used to develop political campaign strategies and messaging, as well as public policy decision-making. So this is about the person. The topic. In recent years, Gamarra's polling has focused on the Latino vote in the United States. He directs a tracking poll of Latino voting patterns. Today, he will be presenting the results of an annual survey on Latinos, Latinas in the United States. His team is still in the data gathering phase, so he will share with us preliminary remarks about the results at this stage. It's not a secret for us, for many of us here, that Latinas and Latinos represent a major political force in the United States and occupy every rung of the economy. As a recent New York Times article put it recently, This sector of the US population owns a considerable stake in the financial success of this country. In the decade from 2012 to 2022, Latino small businesses multiplied by 44%, more than 10 times the rate of other similarly sized businesses. Almost 90% of immigrant Latino ventures earning at least $1 million a year are owned by millennials, people in their late 20s to early 40s who came to the United States as youth. Every year, Latino businesses generate about $800 billion for the US economy. These businesses employ millions of workers. Latinas and Latinos were responsible for 73% of the growth of the US labor force between 2010 and 2020. Today, if Latinas and Latinos in the United States were their own separate nation, they would represent the fifth largest GDP in the world. So, and still, we continue to be largely invisible. As a commentator recently wrote, and I quote, "Even as we fill the classrooms, feed the nation, and help keep the economy afloat, too often we are overlooked, unjustly erased from school curriculums, from the media, from corporate boardrooms, from history. Maybe it's time for America to take a good look." And this takes me to my third point, us as a university. Inviting Eduardo Gamarra to Pitt is an act of visibility. The last time he was here was nearly 3 decades ago. As you saw from my quick facts, we're talking about an immigrant who stands as one of the most influential analysts of US and Latin American politics in the United States, a Pitt grad. And still, Pitt continues to recognize others, often less influential people, because people like Eduardo are not being seen. And I have a problem with that. From my leadership role, I will continue to promote these acts of visibility, as we did it with the Latinx cluster hire, the Center for Ethnic Studies Research, and many other initiatives. So I want to thank the Center for Latin American Studies and its incredibly talented team for organizing this visit. This center has a strong commitment to advancing the well-being and interests of Pittsburgh's Latino community. And we are very, very proud of the work that you do. I don't need to remind you that the upcoming presidential elections are likely to be critical in the history of this country. And Latinas and Latinos will play a decisive role in these elections. So today, we are fortunate to have a world-class expert to share with us a view of the Hispanic, Latino voting attitudes and patterns. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for that very, very generous introduction. I'm thrilled to be back in Pitt, thrilled to be back at class in particular. And it's been a real time travel for me, frankly, the last couple of days. I decided to come a little bit early just to see, how much Pitt had changed and how much Pittsburgh had changed. And I have just one little observation about that, which I was 23 years old when I was here, when I got here. And one of the fascinating things is that I thought this place was much bigger, right? It sort of shrunk in size. I think it's a perception thing, right? When I walked a lot then, I was driving now, maybe that was, but in any event, I'm going to talk to you today about this survey that we've been doing now. This is the 11th version. We're on a 12th year now of doing this tracking of Hispanic voters in the United States. And I'll start out simply by saying that this is a fairly large sample. It's a sample of 1,221, obviously random sample distributed around the country. And the reason I make a big point about the sample size is that most of you are probably accustomed to seeing New York Times polls, New York Times, Siena College, et cetera, right? And if you look at their samples, if you know anything about sampling, then you probably also are jumping to the same conclusion as I am. Those samples are generally not over 150 people nationwide, right? And they're making generalizations about how Hispanics look at politics, how they trend, whether they're going to vote for Biden or Trump more recently, and so on, right? But they're also making some generalizations about patterns in different states. So you can understand a sample of 1,000, right, with nationally with about 100 Latinos in it. It's very difficult to make some accurate predictions about specific states. So what we've done at the Latino Public Opinion Forum over the last decade is we've tried to specifically engage survey research with samples taken of different segments of the Latino Hispanic population, right? Because again, we sort of have this idea Hispanics are one size fits all, but Hispanics are, of course, everything but one size fits all. Not only are we different in terms of when we arrived, we're different in terms of ethnicity, we're different in terms of social class, as you and I were talking about a little earlier, right? But we're also different regions. And probably one of the most fundamental differences is that we are also extraordinarily different when it comes to country of origin. So polling Hispanics is quite difficult, especially if you have a sample of 100 and make predictions about how Latinos behave, right? So we've been trying to somewhat bridge that gap by doing these series of surveys. This is a national survey. We have more specific surveys, for example, of Colombians, of Venezuelans. We do an annual survey of Cubans that some of you may be familiar with. We've been doing that survey since 1993. So we have a very significant time series about how Cubans view the world, right? And specifically how they view Cuba, right? This is sort of a description of how the sample is distributed, so you get a sense of where most are concentrated. Obviously, California, Texas, and Florida are the bulk of this sample. And so let me talk a little bit about Hispanics in the United States, and I'll address the question of Hispanics in just a moment. The whole notion of being a Hispanic. The Hispanic population that's eligible to vote, these are the 12 states with the highest concentration. This is obviously where most of our sample is. As you can see, there are 8.5 million Hispanics in California, and in Massachusetts now there are 485,000, right? It's a fairly significant growth, even in states like Georgia, right? Which we had never really thought of as a Hispanic state, but today is a very, very significant state, particularly in terms of voting, right? And most of you, of course, know in Florida, I always have to explain, especially to our audience, what the difference is between the national vote and the electoral vote, right? But Georgia has become very significant in the electoral cycle, as has Arizona, for example. We're going to be talking about that in more detail a little bit later. And this is the percentage of the Hispanic population, of the voter population that's eligible. And if you look at it, you know, New Mexico, which has a fairly small population, has the highest concentration of 45%, right? In other words, 45% of those eligible to vote in in New Mexico are Hispanic, and then of course the smaller numbers here. So this gives you a sense of how important the Hispanic Latino vote is becoming, largely because it will take, in some states that are going to determine the outcome, like Georgia, like Nevada, and probably, of course, others where we didn't sample, like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and the like, and Wisconsin, right? It'll take a variation of 2 to 4% to determine the outcome in that particular state. So again, that's where we think that polling Hispanics is important, especially in the context of the extraordinary polarization that our country is living through. Okay? All right, so let's start then by looking at how Hispanics see themselves. Now, we've asked this question for a number of years now, and so has Pew. And if you look at the Pew sample, for example, 76% of Hispanics have never heard of the term Latinx. If you look at ours, we've never received more than 1.5, 1.7, I think is what we had in the poll last year, right? So Latinx is something that, in fact, is it's more of a kind of an academic university term than it is something the way Hispanics look at themselves. Prefer to be called Hispanics, right? And Latinos is very interesting. I don't have the crosstabs here, but it's interesting to see, for example, how in the East Coast, Hispanics prefer to be called Hispanics. In the West Coast, they prefer to be called Latinos, right? That's kind of an interesting thing, right? And exploring the reasons why, I think, is an interesting question, right? Okay, now, so let me delve right into this, because I have a lot of, and I'll be glad to share this presentation with you, by the way. Okay, so we asked, right, what direction is the country going in? Right direction, wrong direction. Mind you, these are American citizens. This is a survey sample taken out of voter rolls, right? And so one of the things that we'll find, these are people that will likely vote, right? And what we found, of course, is that it's really not very different. It's a little better, but not that much different than what the general population thinks about the direction of the country. And of course, if you look at Florida, right, the direction of the country in Florida is much worse, right, from the perspective of Hispanics there. Now, when you look at the distribution by state, then you can see something quite interesting, right? And this, again, thinking about it in terms of how they will vote in November. Arizona, 72.9% think that the country's going in the wrong direction. If you look at Florida, 65, Colorado, 69, look at Nevada, 76%, right? And so on. So this sort of tells you a little bit about the direction that the Latino vote appears to be going, right? That they're not too comfortable with the direction of the country, and we're seeing this broken down throughout the United States. Now, we asked a couple, this is an open question, and sorry, you probably can't see it in the back. This is an open question. We asked, what is the most important problem in the United States? And the most important problem, of course, is inflation. Again, this is very similar to others and how others see the US. But what we were really surprised by is that third place is immigration and border control, right? Again, these are US citizens looking at immigration. And so we asked another open question about what is your opinion about the principal national security threat, right? And what we found there is that open borders, right, and immigrants not vetted, this is a kind of bringing together several answers. But among Hispanics, then, the idea that open borders are the principal threat to national security is important. Of course, you look at Florida, for example, it's also fairly high, right? And I don't think I have the distribution by states, but it's also fairly high, right? If you look at it, the distribution by party, of course, those who say they're Republicans, right, have a much higher perception of immigration as a national security threat, right? And Democrats fairly low, right? So, but it's still up there, and that is just leads me, and we look at this perhaps too much from a Florida perspective, but let me share with you the following. On November 9th, right as we were, in fact, in the field with this, the Republicans had a debate in Miami and in the evening. And in the afternoon, Donald Trump held a rally in Hialeah. I don't know how many of you know Hialeah, but Hialeah is the population of Hispanics in Hialeah is about between 95 and 100%. Okay, mainly Cubans, but recently others have been going there. Right, there are about 80,000 to 100,000 Cubans who have arrived just in the last 2 months into Hialeah. Right, so Donald Trump gave this speech there to a large crowd of Hispanics, where he announced for the very first time that he was going to round up illegal, as he used the term, right, immigrants, and he was going to carry out the largest massive scale deportation in the United States, right? And he received a standing ovation from this crowd of individuals, right, who are Hispanics, most of whom probably came to the United States as undocumented aliens. And of course, here's a very important definition in terms of who is undocumented and who is not. My very first job was with Mariel immigrants back before I came to Pitt in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. I interviewed literally hundreds of Marielitos, right? Who came in the boat lift in 1980. Well, most of them came in here, right? And they were given papers, right? Once they arrived, much like is happening today. You go to the border, you present yourself before an immigration official, they give you parole or they give you some kind of a status, right? So technically they're not illegal anymore once you get that status. But now we have in our survey, when we look at Marielitos, those whom we've interviewed, right? Marielitos are only in favor of documented legal immigration. So it's really kind of an interesting thing, right? It's this sort of this idea, right, that, well, the last one in the boat, please pull up the ladder because the boat is full, right? And this perception that we who are here and are documented are much better than those who are coming behind us, right? And I think there are a lot of things that have to do with not only time of arrival, but certainly they have to do now with race, they have to do with social class as well. And you can see this across the different immigrant groups. You can see it from Venezuelans to Cubans to Colombians and even Mexicans, as some of those of you who may remember the 1980s in California. Okay. All right, so by gender, okay, and here by national origin, right? See, if you look at this from the perspective of different national origin groups, right? How they consider it to be a national security threat, right? Now, by American, we're talking about Latinos who say they are Americans first. They are of Latino origin, but they are Americans, right? Born in the United States. Okay, and then here by state, it's not surprising that New Mexico and New York would come up. New York largely because of the immigration situation that they've been facing over the last few years. And of course, in California as well to a certain extent. Okay? All right. So let me move here very, very quickly. We also have been very concerned about how messaging, particularly about two issues, abortion and vaccinations, right, have been transmitted, and how Hispanics are assimilating misinformation or disinformation. And so we asked some questions, right, which basically test disinformation, right? And for example, on this one, right, it's fairly interesting, right, for the termination of pregnancy after 6 weeks, right? What is the level of agreement, right? It's a fairly high level of agreement, right? But you'll see in the next question, and this is probably a more interesting question, right? We asked this question, right, which is the correct answer. What do you think is the correct answer?
1%.
1%. 1%. Okay, so most of you probably have heard Trump and others say, it's termination of pregnancy up until the day of birth, right? But only 1% of abortions are actually carried out after 12 weeks. Okay, and generally those are exceptional circumstances in which they occur. But now what we have found is that Hispanics aren't. I was telling Scott this morning. Hispanics are not any more susceptible to disinformation than others are. We're all susceptible to disinformation because it's constantly pounded as truth, right? And once it gets mainstreamed. And now this is, of course, of critical concern as well, because one of the real issues that we have, particularly in Florida, is with disinformation about vaccines. We are now currently experiencing a serious measles outbreak in Broward County, right? And state officials, in fact, right, have essentially ratified some of these perceptions about vaccination. So while yes, saying that 70% say that immunization is a good thing, but it also tells us that another 30% does not think that vaccinations are a good thing, right? So think about it from the political moment that we're living in, right? Many people believe that vaccinations are not good, and they're largely buying that discourse from political parties. Okay. Now, so let me go specifically into party ID here, right? And it's kind of interesting how this breaks down nationally. Most Hispanics are still telling us that they're Democrats, right? 56% say that they are Democrats. Only 26% tell us that they identify or think of themselves as Republicans, right? With the remainder sort of between independent and don't know, right? Now, when we look at this though, by state, it's really quite interesting, right? Because again, you can see, for example, in Florida is now a red state, right? And it's a red state among Hispanics, right? But you can see this also happening or very close to happening in other states as well, especially Arizona, Nevada in particular, right? And places where, again, the electoral cycle will be critical, right? And the Hispanic vote will be critical. Now here we try to say, okay, so you say most say that they are Democrats. Which party do you identify with the most, right? In terms of your values, which represents your values the most? And not only our surveys, but those from Pew and Gallup and so on, essentially ratify this, that Hispanics still think that the Democratic Party represents their values the best. But this is really quite interesting what comes after, right? When we ask them, well, have you considered switching parties in the last year? Now, we've asked this question over a few years now, and we're getting similar results. 71% say they haven't, but nearly 20% says that they have. Okay, so we try to get into this and say, okay, if you've considered switching parties, how have you considered switching, right? And here's what it looks like, right? Of that 19%, nearly 40% tell us that they've considered switching from the Democratic to the Republican. Okay. All right. And so, and then you have others from Democratic to independent. That's also, so there's really two trends here, right? One moving from the Democratic to Republican, and moving from Democrat to independent. Those are two trends that we've been seeing now for a while. When you look at the breakdown by parties, again, look at where this is, right? From Democrat to Republican in Arizona, key states, right? In Nevada, right? We had from Democrat to independent, right? And let me show you a couple more here, and then just broken down by region. See, you still see these two broad trends from Democrat to Republican and from Democrat to independent. Right? So the Democrats, in some measure, ought to be concerned. Right? Now, And then the breakdown by the rest, right? Northeast, Southwest, et cetera. Okay. And then Texas and Colorado, right? Indiana and Ohio, small, very small samples there. Okay. Okay. And in the Northeast, right? We had a very small sample here in Pennsylvania, but it's 50-50, right? Okay. And okay. All right. And in Florida, right? I want to tell you something. So here's people that have considered switching, but let me just delve into Florida because I have some fairly good data for Florida, right? This is registration, right? In Florida, of Hispanics, 58% are eligible to vote, right? It's 22% of the eligible voter population, right? But when you look at this, right, this is the registration in Florida. Now, the majority are Republicans, okay? But it's interesting to see, right, that when you look at this in more detail, you can see something really quite interesting, that the largest party affiliation in Florida is non-party affiliate, right? They're registering as independents, right? In second place is still the Democratic Party. There are still in Florida more Hispanics who are Democrats than Hispanics who are Republicans. Okay, but there's some critical differences here, and I'll show you where that comes up. It's really critical in counties like Miami-Dade, right? Where now it's overwhelmingly Republican. Most Hispanics are in Miami-Dade, of course, and this is largely driven by Cubans, by Colombians. Probably, I know that we have a few Colombians here, or at least one, right? But Colombians are the ones that have most radically shifted to the right in the last few years. And two things seem to be moving them in the direction of the right. And again, Scott, in terms of the conversation we had about foreign policy this afternoon, I won't have time to get into this, but the foreign policy questions are really interesting. Among these groups, they tell us two things. One, what policy is coming out of Washington? So we ask, what factors lead you to vote for a specific candidate, right? And the one thing is what Washington is doing with respect to my country. And then the second thing is whatever is happening back home. And when you look at countries like Colombia, for example, the fact that the Biden administration lifted restrictions on the FARC, right? They look at it as the FARC, but these are the people in the FARC that actually gave up arms, right, and are in Congress, right? That decision alone marked an enormous shift in attitudes by Colombians about Washington. And then, of course, the election of Petro, right, moved Colombians in Florida way to the right. Okay, so and when we tested the same kind of thing with Venezuelans, we got a very similar response, right? The lifting of sanctions by the Biden administration last year had an enormous impact on how Venezuelans in Florida saw U.S. foreign policy. And of course, the cracking down in Venezuela against Maria Corina Machado and others, right? That has also largely had an impact on how they see foreign policy. Let me move very quickly here. So I was telling you, right, that which party handles foreign policy, issues the best, right? The Democrats. There's this view that the Democrats are still better. So look at the contradiction, right? You still, now, clearly when you do the crosstabs, you'll see a little different, but overall, right, nationally, Democrats are still perceived as doing better than Republicans on issues like education, like the economy, like immigration, and so on, right? Now, this changes a little bit when you go into states. In Florida, obviously, immigration is the territory of Donald Trump. Now, maybe in Pennsylvania, it's not as big an issue as perceptions about capitalism and socialism. We try to say, okay, what do you think about capitalism? right? And again, very general question, right? What is your opinion? Positive, negative, or neutral, right? Remember that a lot of the messaging, right, in the campaign recently has been about how bad socialism is, right? If you're a Democrat, you're a socialist, especially in Florida, right? But it's also becoming kind of a national message. Well, look at this, right? Well, these are Democrats, American citizens, right? I mean, it kind of sits right here, right? And very negative views about capitalism are fairly small. Okay, well, that's maybe something that we, especially those of you who are in the business school might say, well, this is to be expected, right? But, and look, divides among different parties. But look at this. And we asked the same question about socialism. All right. No difference, right? I mean, still, perhaps a little bit higher on the negative side, right? Now, clearly, when you hold, for state and so on, then it becomes much more pronounced in places like Florida. And if you look at Cubans and so on, but it's still, right? Most have, I mean, we didn't ask, do you know what socialism is? Do you know what capitalism is? Well, we sort of put it in this very broad context. But there's no significant difference in perceptions about socialism and in perceptions about capitalism, right? Yet this is the central messaging that the Republicans are using in Florida, right? Socialism is terrible, and here on this, let me tell you that one of the things that we've been looking at, we were the ones who looked at some zip codes in Hialeah, which is Cuban, and Doral in Miami, which is Venezuelan and Cuban, right? So we took some zip codes and we looked at the percentage of Obamacare use, right? In those zip codes, where they have the highest consumption per capita of Obamacare in the entire United States. Okay. All right. And in those very same zip codes, right? Trump won by over 75% of the votes. Okay. So isn't that an interesting thing, right? So yes, well, Obamacare is socialism, of course, but and it's sort of the same thing, by the way, when we ask, you want closed borders? Yes, but please let my cousin come in before you close them, right? So we humans do that, right? And Hispanics are humans, despite what Donald Trump said this weekend, right? So they have the same kind of. Okay, now, and I'll end in a few minutes, so we'll open it up for questions. How likely are you to vote in the next elections? Remember, these are registered voters, right? Fairly high, right? Do you approve of Biden? Right? Fairly strong approval, not generally what you would find among Hispanics of Democratic presidents. Usually the approval is much higher, right? But here's where it gets interesting, right? Remember, so far, Hispanics say Democrats are better on policy, Democrats are better on our values and so on. But then we asked them, do you want Joe Biden to run in 2024? And here's what we got. Okay. 44.7 say no, only 35% say yes. Okay. In other words, they're Democrats, but they don't like Joe Biden, right? Now, in the more qualitative dimension of this study, we're finding that the answer is age, right? Age tends to be the main factor, right? So we obviously said, well, okay, this is interesting, right? Let's, if you do it by party, it's obvious, Democrats want, and Republicans predictably want the opposite. But so we asked the same question of Donald Trump. Should Donald Trump run for office, right? And again here, we have no, 57% say no, and 32% say yes. Okay, so these are now, and when you do the party breakdown, of course, it's obvious that among Republicans, yes, 69%. You see, this is an interesting contrast, isn't it? Because It's the very same as you find in the general population. Trumpists are devout. Democrats are not, right? And so this is where they're going to be more than likely to come out and turn out for Donald Trump than are Democratic Latinos for Biden. Okay. And that, of course, should give us a little bit to worry about if you share my view about where the country's going, right? All right. And then of course we said, okay, so given all that, for whom will you vote in 2024? Right? And this is what it looks like. Okay. All right. And again, Biden will win among Hispanics nationally. He'll lose in Florida, right? But here's the key. He had 69% in 2020. All right. And Donald Trump had 29% in 2020, right? Remember what I said, it takes 2 to 4% in any election among Hispanics for Republicans to really have a chance to win. Okay? There are some surveys where this is as high as 36%, right? And in Florida, it's completely inverted. So that's the presentation. And why don't I stop there and open it up for you? And as I said, I'll be glad to share the presentation with you and any comments you might have. So.
Sorry, Jeff. This is really great, really amazing numbers. So many things to ask about. Try to get towards the end of what you were saying, kind of the source of this amazing shift, because as you suggested, they prefer the Democrats and all these policies, yet they're pulling up their ladders and voting there. You also kind of hinted that maybe it's about disinformation, that they're listening to all of these stories and hearing them. So I guess that means that they're getting more information from the Republican side than the Democratic side. But did I sort of read that right? That that's the disinformation campaign that you're attributing this shift to in some sense, since it's not policy?
That's a very interesting question, Scott, because we're getting and again, forgive my Florida blinders, because Florida has undergone, as political scientists we would call it, realignment. I think there is a realignment in Florida, and it's going to probably take a generation to shift back. Okay. We haven't had a Democratic governor for the last 30 years. And we don't have a statewide Democratic official, right? We had one, Nikki Fried, who now runs the Democratic Party, just until 2022. But there are no elected Democratic officials, statewide officials in England. The legislature is in control by the Republicans, right? And of course, you all know our governor, right? So, this is really a one-party state, right? And it very much acts like that. So you're constantly bombarded by Republican messaging, right? But that said, right, I think there's a lot of it has to do with the way in which Democrats have been addressing Hispanics, right? And in another presentation, I say that Hispanics don't do three things, right? They never start early on a campaign. They always start late. And this is a national problem for Democrats, right? They always start campaigning late. The Republicans never stop campaigning, right? And this is a real issue. The second thing that they do is that they pick candidates which are not very good candidates, especially if you're trying to say, well, we're going to face this onslaught of Republicans coming in, right? And picking the wrong candidate has a lot to do with other things. One of the questions we asked, for example, Scott, is the question about progressive, right? See, if I say progressive here, most of you are going to say, well, progressive is a great thing, right? But when we ask progressive of Hispanics, right, and especially in Florida, it's really kind of interesting. When we measure progressive, right, the first image that comes into mind is they look at, Evo Morales calling himself a progressive. They look at Hugo Chavez, and in fact, the Republicans ran a commercial, a spot with, you had Nancy Pelosi coming into town and saying, we're progressives, right? And so immediately they had her and Hugo Chavez, right? Fidel Castro, and all of these people with videos saying we're progressives, right? So picking candidates who are progressives is really complicated because you cannot campaign on a progressive agenda, right? You can be progressive, but just don't campaign on it. That's what I'm telling you, right? Because as soon as you do, look, defending Obamacare is a very reasonable thing, right? But you can't campaign on on the messaging of progressive. There's one race that I'm looking very carefully at today, which is a campaign by a former member of the lower house, Debbie Mucarsel Powell. She's Ecuadorian, right? She served in Congress for two years and then was defeated by this woman, Maria Elvira Salazar, whom some of you may know from Telemundo, right? Rabid right-wing Republican, right? Who, when I knew her, I met her in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and she wasn't as rabid and right-wing then, right? But times change. But in any event, Debbie is running against Senator Scott, okay, who was the governor. Now, Senator Scott has a very interesting characteristic, and it goes to those two things I said earlier. He started courting Latinos about 12 years ago, right? And he started preparing himself. He learned Spanish, right? And now he campaigns in Spanish and talks in Spanish and does things that really, approximate what he thinks is a good. His Spanish is terrible, but it's Spanish, right? And people like that, right? Now, Debbie's problem is that when she was in the legislature, she became very close to some of the progressive women in the House, right? Especially Ocasio-Cortez, right? And so she's being hit with a communist label. And what she's done, I think, fairly well is she's kind of moved away from that and saying, I'm not a progressive. I believe in free enterprise. I believe in these kinds of things. So it's really kind of interesting the way I think she's a good candidate. It's going to be hard for her to win. Surveys have her fairly close to Scott. If she defeats him, I think it'll be interesting. Very hard, but it'll be interesting. So poor candidate choice. And then the third thing, which this survey, I think drives home the idea, right? The third thing that Democrats don't do or do is they take Latinos for granted, right? Why should we campaign? You're a Latino. Latinos are Democrats. We don't need to waste any money on them. We have to focus on other groups. And this year in particular, and since 2020, I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing, but Biden did not win Florida in 2020, right? And what that has done to the Democrats is basically told them that you can win the White House without Florida, right? So the pathway to the White House is not through Florida, and that means that the Democratic Party has spent very little money in Florida, very little. They've given it up. But you saw the figures for Arizona and Georgia, right? And the Democrats are spending more there, but the trend in both of those states is rather worrisome, right? Not just from the registration, right? But certainly from most polls that have the results that I have. So those three things are really, I think, where Democrats have essentially gotten it wrong. And I say this nationally. Florida is certainly the extreme, but I think they're doing it nationally as well. Okay. Yes.
So thank you for that presentation. In business, we like to say the 9/10 of any venture is good marketing. So things cannot be good, but if you have a good marketing strategy, become good.
Yeah.
So, and there's a book about the super communicators that just came out.
Yeah, I know it.
And they are, so My question was about what the two parties are doing in terms of communication and digital social media and budgets. How much budgets are they putting into their both campaigns?
Yeah, yeah. In the presentation, we also ask these questions about where Hispanics get their news, right? And I mean, this is something that La Pulp has been doing about Latin America and so on. And there's a bunch of people that do this kind of thing. Ours really highlights something very important. Hispanics really over-index in the use of social media. Okay, they are very, very much into social media communications, and they're largely users of things like, and I'm grouping all of the platforms, especially WhatsApp, right? And WhatsApp and its linkage to politics in particular, right? So WhatsApp has become an enormous vehicle for communications. And so one of the things that we're finding is, when we ask them, where do you get your news about politics? Number one is social media, right? And they also trust social media, which is really, really kind of interesting. They distrust traditional media, but they trust their social media outlets, right? And there's a whole range of things that they also do. For example, they trust, obviously, if I send you a WhatsApp message with news, right? You know me, we're friends, right? You're going to believe me more than you're going to believe a traditional media outlet. So there's that familial thing as well. And this has an enormous impact with the role that it has in disinformation, right? And one of the things that we've been looking at specifically in this polling is the impact, for example, and you remember this, of course, audio from Miami, turning on the radio, right? Radio is very big in them, right? And among Hispanics, right? And you can listen to Caracol from Bogota, or you can listen to any particular station from anywhere, depending on your nationality, right? But mornings are generally a little bit more liberal than the afternoon. In the afternoon, especially from about 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock, there are now 5 radio stations, 5 that are repeating, right, the same Republican message, right? Joe Biden is a crook, his son should be in jail, and you hear this and it's told as fact, right? And what we've done in the work that we're now evaluating is what we've seen is really something quite interesting. That they get, for example, they'll read things that are being sent to them from social media, right? This is what people who study disinformation call mainstream. So you get a particular, false information, but then a trustworthy figure reads it and it becomes true, right? So Biden is a crook, right? Which comes from a WhatsApp message or what have you. It may even come from a place like Fox, right? And then it gets translated into this with these Hispanic groups, right? And so the intensity of those messages, right, is good marketing. Okay, extraordinarily good marketing, right? Now, what the Democrats tried to do is they said, okay, if we just buy a bunch of stations in Miami, we can counter this. Okay, well, guess what? It hasn't worked, right? It hasn't worked at all. They bought one station there, and in fact, they see, and this is perhaps the problem with liberals. If you might take my criticism. See, liberals believe in fair play, right? And so, what the owners of this new station say? Well, you know what? We're going to be balanced. We're going to keep some of the conservative hosts, right? The radio, whatever you call them, hosts, and we're gonna bring in some liberals, but we don't want to anger the community. So when you turn on the radios that are owned by this Democratic Soros, they called it Soros station, right? Soros was one of the funders, right? When you turn it on, and I don't find any significant difference in terms of the hosts, right? They're still hosts. In fact, one of the hosts is the guy who used to be in Cuba as one of the main propagandists for the Cuban regime. It's interesting how quickly they switch, right? They arrive in Miami and they're essentially doing the same thing, only on the other side, right? So that's effective marketing, right? But and it's social media that's being used, and certainly in terms of video and the use of Instagram, the use of TikTok as well, right? Those of you who follow elections in Latin America, of course, know this, the way in which TikTok almost made a presidential candidate, 80-year-old president of Colombia, right? Just TikTok, right? Guillermo Lasso in Ecuador, right? Largely became president because of the use of TikTok by Macri's former political advisor. So Hispanics are really, they over-index. That's why we say 82% of Hispanics in the United States get access to internet via their cell phone. Okay? 82%. So if you want to market to Hispanics, that's why the firm that's been one of our co-founders, Ads Mobile, that's what they do, right? If you log into the internet through your phone, you'll see all the pop-ups. That's Ads Mobile doing. Okay. And we've been able to actually do some survey using these pop-ups. Very effective, right? Yes, you know.
My question is more related to you're called Hispanic, and we do school visits from 8 to 12, and that's one of the things we do a presentation on who are we, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latinx. And a lot of the questions we get, and this is children, and they always say, well, why you have so many names? Why can you not come up with one? So when I saw Hispanic, thinking of my Brazilian friends, how do you include that group of people? Because in a way, it excludes certain groups of people. People say, no, I'm Latino, Latina. So how you balance that out to do the surveys?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. It's one that it's hard because precisely the Brazilians, right? Brazilians always complain they have no cabinet, right? And what they're doing is they're signing off as Latinos, right? And it's not working very effectively, right? Because you can't. In fact, very few states. Remember, when you register to vote, remember this. We get this from voter registration, right? We don't get this from anywhere else. But to get national origin, we have to ask them for national origin. Okay? Because it doesn't, when you register, I don't know what it's like in Pennsylvania, but certainly in Florida, if you register, it'll say, what's your ethnicity, right? Or what is, but it won't say what's your national origin. It'll ask you basically, you consider yourself Hispanic. And that's the other problem. They'll ask you, are you Hispanic or what have you, right? Black or Hispanic is a race, right? But it really isn't, right? And then they'll ask you the race question. And here's where all of us in Florida in particular, the choices are African American, right? Hispanics in South Florida, especially, we're white. We think of ourselves as white, right? Until we go into Broward County and go into the rest of the United States and we discover that we're not. Right? But in Florida, we're white, right? We think we're white. And that leads to another thing, identity-wise, by the way, right? In terms of campaigns. I've found over the years in working in campaigns with Democrats, and it's a big fight that I generally have, because we insist on campaigning, marketing, right, to Hispanics the same way as we campaign to African Americans. In other words, through the prism of the civil rights struggles of the United States. Okay? And let me tell you, unless you're Mexican and remember Cesar Chavez, most Hispanics don't have the prism of affirmative action and so on. And especially in the East Coast, they look at themselves as what? The American dream. They want to be treated as the American dream, not as an entitlement, right? And that becomes a real problem in campaigning as well. Okay, so going back to your question, right? We were really struck by how many people don't know of Latinx, right? and how many people reject Latinx. I didn't show you that, but the rejection level of Latinx is enormous. They feel offended by Latinx. Right?
What about Latinx?
Oh, Latinx, I mean, we didn't ask that, but it's even worse. Right? It's, they don't, and in fact, just ask your Milei, right? Milei just got rid of it, right? This week, right? Or 2 weeks ago, right? I don't know if you know, Milei prohibited the use of inclusive language now in policy, right? So there's a real rejection of this, and again, when you ask somebody, I mean, I've often called myself a Latino, right? But maybe that was my initial foray into the U.S. when I was in California, right, in the 70s. But today in Florida, it's Hispanic, right? And as I called it when I founded this institute. I called it the Latino Public Opinion Forum. Now I've got pressure to change it to Hispanic, Public Opinion Forum, right? So it's a huge issue. But with Brazilians, I don't know what we're going to do because we didn't survey any Brazilians here. When they identified as Brazilian, we excluded them. Okay, so and we didn't get that many either, right? But we are going to do a survey of Brazilian in Florida. There are about 400,000 Brazilians. So it's a fairly large sample. Yes, sir.
I mean, listening to you, first I can imagine there might be a college or some presentation right now where people are talking about misinformation from the right side and saying those liberals believe what they're listening, exactly what we are saying. And I'm on your side, just sure. But that's what's happening. I mean, they believe that we are misinformed as much as we do that they are. So we don't even have a common language anymore. And political parties became like Brazilians against Argentinians playing soccer. It's the other team I'm against, no matter what.
Right.
Which in soccer, fair and fine, but in politics, we're talking about the future of our kids and the world. What is the solution? And just a little hint. I talked to a politician from Pennsylvania. The founding fathers, when they were organizing and thinking about how they were going to do it, there were not going to be two political parties. Of course, there could be more, like many other countries, you know that, but maybe no political party. Maybe there was a little conversation about we will be voting for causes. You like abortion, immigration, right? You're going to find a candidate that mostly fits your needs or what you believe. What, where, what, how?
A couple of years ago, I wrote a book called "The Nation Divided," edited book with the idea was I'm a Democrat. I don't think I gave that away, right? But so I co-edited the book with a Republican representative in Congress and a Democratic representative in Congress, and with my colleague Dario Moreno, right? And the idea was to sort of say, okay, how do we answer your question? So, but we were looking at the root causes of this polarization. We didn't come up with an answer, but it's very clear that polarization is a problem that's not just in the United States; it's a worldwide issue. Right? And it's also, I obviously gave you the impression from this that only Republicans do disinformation. That's not true, right? Everybody disinforms in some, right? And we all, we make the very strong distinction between misinformation, right, and disinformation. Obviously, all of us understand the difference. I mean, this is purposeful information, right? But everybody engages in it. And in campaigns, I now have enough campaigns under my belt to know that it's the candidate who, we used to call it in political science, we used to call it differentiating ourselves, right? We needed to contrast ourselves with the opponent. Well, today, contrasting essentially means radical polarizing with your opponent. And that includes, right? I mean, for a long time, we talked about negative campaigning, right? And we have books and articles written on negative campaigning, and negative campaigning is today, is really about disinformation. And of course, with the use of social media and AI in particular, it's becoming even worse, especially in Latin America.
Because everybody's an expert. I mean, before you had like some journalists from the New York Times, Washington Post, right, left.
Now
Everybody
right.
has
But let me tell you something, since I detect from your accent a slight, Carioca accent, maybe.
not totally, but not far. Okay.
But let me tell you that in the last Brazilian elections, right? You may recall that Jair Bolsonaro left and came to Florida, right?
Right.
Stayed in Doral.
Well, he was president.
Yeah, stayed in Doral and then went to Orlando. Okay. Well, we're doing the disinformation project with Jonathan Scacco at the University of South Florida, and he has this very important grant to follow disinformation. He studied that particular incident, okay, and especially the January 8th incident. Ours is here the January 6th, the Brazilians is the January 8th incident, right? And in fact, Bolsonaro is now being prosecuted.
Indicted.
And he was indicted, and his passport has been taken. More than likely, who knows? But in any event, well, Jonathan Scacco monitored the social media disinformation, right? And guess where it was coming from? The majority was originating in Orlando on January. Okay. So they developed this machinery, right? And then the other part was being generated out of Buenos Aires, where Eduardo Bolsonaro was working very closely with a guy that has been advising Ray, right? So very, very interesting how, you don't have to be in country anymore to disinform, right? And but all of the messaging about January 8th was being originated not in Brazil but outside of Brazil.
Probably a little bit a smaller part was Bannon too.
Was where?
Bannon.
Oh yeah, well, Bannon was involved in this, right? Yeah. But so again, it's a different world, right? And but I don't have the answer to your question. Maybe our political scientists here do, right? But I think unless we can bridge that gap, right, bipartisan approaches, will fail. Unless we get to that anyway, right? Yeah. Let me get to
Well, I don't know if I'm contributing or not in a sense, but it's hard to talk. You can see the formation of these quote machines that have been going on since the Koch brothers. Everyone else has been putting billions of dollars into it internationally. But it seems like to me all of this is not just polarization, but part of the polarization process is fragmentation of ideas. So, for instance, we have progressives here in Allegheny County who their offices, but now the attack is somebody, it's a communist, maybe she's a progressive. Ironically, if communism is bad, why is Donald Trump such a friend of Putin? I mean, we mix everything up and throw it up like a tossed salad. And I think when people don't have a clear, I hate to say it, I don't want to say message anymore, a clear idea of what anyone stands for, it's easy to go polarized because that's the easy way to hang your hat on something. And I think social media and the parties themselves have led to this kind of fragmentation. And then comes the cult of Donald Trump, or the cult of whoever else. Those people are devout. They don't care about whether Putin is this or that. They love Donald Trump. It's a religion almost.
Yeah.
And that's not saying that there's good solutions to all this. It's just
Frank, last week in Miami, one of the TV stations, Channel 10, had a town hall, and I was one of the participants with two Republican women. One was Mosca Perez Castellón, you probably remember, right? That very same question came up. And it was fascinating to see how strong a defense of Trump with regard to his endorsement or like-mindedness with Putin, right? So it's really interesting, considering that Putin is Evo's best friend, Maduro's best friend, Canel's best friend.
All these categories don't mean anything.
Yeah, no, so that's part of the confusion that we have. Right? So again, it's I'm not sure what the answer is.
There's no answers,
Right? But that's where we are.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Eduardo, I wanted to ask you, when it comes to some of the most important political attitudes, are there any major differences according to age and according to first whether one has been born in the US or immigrated, and second, how many years someone has been living in the US?
It does. The answer is yes, and we have that in the slides that I hid. Okay, age does make a difference, right? And so younger Hispanics outside of Florida, right, tend to be more liberal, right? Tend to be more committed to the Democratic Party, right? So that's good news for the Democrats, but not in Florida. In Florida, one of the things that we found, and it's really quite striking, that even young people, right, are very conservative, right? Very identified with the Republican Party, right? And that's surprising, right? I see it among some of my students, right? But I certainly see it outside of them, right? The other thing, time of arrival, right? We've often hypothesized, and especially in the Cuba poll, we hypothesized, right, that time of arrival would make a clear difference. That those who arrived very late were the most conservative, right? Those who came in the 60s and so on. And then with each wave, they would become more liberals, right? And in fact, I was telling you this a little bit earlier. What we found is that nationally, that is the trend. You have it in the survey, right? Those who came before the 1980s, right, and so on, more conservative, and so on and so forth. But as you progress, they become much more open to the Democratic Party, especially. Remember, a lot of these people we interviewed, right? 36% of the sample are Americans. They're born in the United States, right? So they tend to be, more liberal, right? But when you look at those by wave of arrival of those who are naturalized, that's where you see the difference, very clear difference. And one of the striking things that we're finding, again, Florida, this is why I say there's a real line there, is because what you're seeing is that even among recent arrivals, right, Trumpism is very strong. Okay? Even among recent arrivals. Even though they're being discriminated against, right, they're still identifying with Donald Trump. So there's I think there's an awful lot of work to be done with this, and by the way, I think that the data that we have, we've got a couple of PhD dissertations now that are coming out of this, but certainly I'd love to see more work being done on this area. All right, I think I've gotten to most of you, so thank you very much for your.
Thank you, Dr. Gamarra. And I just want to remind everybody that the YouTube recording of this will be available on our YouTube page. And I want to reiterate our thanks to both our Vice Chancellor and to Dr. Gamarra for being here today.